Welcome to the series of Kafner Ag Experimentation virtual field days, and especially the field day of the Horticulture and Agroforestry. My name is David Trinklein, Adjunct Associate Professor of Plant Science. Additionally, the State Extension Horticultural Specialist with duties in greenhouse crops and vegetables. And then also I act as the coordinator for the Missouri Extension Master Gardener program. A number of years ago, there was a scathing report published that investigated the use of tax money on research that the investigating committee thought to be just totally worthless or anti-productive with regard to having the good of the public in mind. The report was titled Hard Tomatoes, Hard Times, and it was a report on the failure, in the estimation of the reporting committee, of America's land-grant college research efforts. The reason they chose the title Hard Tomatoes, Hard Times is that, quite frankly, research was aimed at that time, conducted by universities, which turned tomatoes into the firmness of a rock. Now, there was a reason for that. The reason, however, was aimed at the producer and trying to enhance the producer's income as opposed to the ultimate consumer and the eating experience of the tomato developed. This is why tomatoes, frankly, have lost most of their flavor if they're shipped in. These are the 6 stages of ripening that are defined by the American vegetable growers. And normally, tomatoes are picked at what is known as the breaker stage. Just a slight amount of pink showing on the distal or blossom end of the tomato, and then these are packed, sent long distances, and I'll use the term ripened rather loosely, but they're ripened, or more appropriately, they turn red after being exposed to ethylene gas. Well, research was aimed at developing tomatoes in this stage that were extremely firm and that would stand shipping very well. Totally ignored, however, was the table quality, the eating quality of tomato at the distant end of the journey, where they finally were artificially ripened with the gas ethylene. So, the title of the presentation is Growing a Better Tomato. What is a better tomato, we might ask ourselves to begin with. I think in most cases, a better tomato is one that is more flavorful, one that simply tastes better, has better what we call table quality. Now, we know that locally produced tomatoes usually have better quality than those that are picked at a distance in the breaker stage, shipped hundreds of miles, and then artificially ripened. We'll explore why that is, and then talk about, well, how do we grow those tomatoes locally? First of all, a little bit of genetics. The equation I equals H times Z stands for every living individual, be it a plant or an animal, is what they are because of an interaction of their hereditary makeup, also known as genetics, in the environment in which that makeup is allowed to express itself. So an individual is a product of genetics and environment. Let's give you an example here with tomato. On the left you see grape tomatoes, which might struggle to get 1, maybe 2 ounces at the very most. versus a bragging size slicer at the right-hand side. The grape tomatoes on the left do not have the genetic ability to develop into anything larger than the size they are in the picture, regardless of what the environment is. So in their case, the size is limited not by the environment necessarily, but by genetic factors or hereditary factors. Contrast that with the beefsteak type on the right. That has the genetic ability, given the environment is conducive to allowing its expression to develop into a huge tomato, perhaps in excess of 20 or 24 ounces, as the case is with some of the Goliath types. So again, we want to keep in mind as we talk about developing a better tomato, we can only do this in the context of the ability from a hereditary standpoint of the tomato in an ideal environment to express itself. The best genetics in a poor environment will turn out poorly. The worst genetics in a good environment will turn out poorly. So what we're after is to find the best genetics from the standpoint of, quote, better tomatoes and create the better environment or the best environment for them. The question arises then, what is good tomato flavor? Just as beauty is in the eye of the beholder, so would taste be on the taste buds or tongue of the person eating, in this case, a tomato. By and large, tomato flavor has been found to be a ratio of the amount of sugar contained by the tomato fruit versus the amount of acid contained by the tomato. Chart that you see here gives us some combinations of the amount of acidity and the amount of sugar and the perceived flavor for a majority of the people. The first being high acidity and high sugar content. That by most would be judged to be good tomato flavor. Again, high acidity and high sugar content. If we retain that high acidity, but the sugar content is low, that is perceived to be rather tart by most people. Now, again, some might find that to be very flavorful to them. I recall going to grad school with an Englishman whose ideal tomato was small, seedy, and very, very tart. Well, let's remember that the English put vinegar on their French fries as opposed to ketchup. So theirs is a taste that's more developed to appreciate tart or sour things. If we go ahead and reverse and have a situation of low acidity but high sugar content, those tomatoes tend to be rather bland. They don't taste unpleasant, but nonetheless, they don't give that good tomato flavor which everyone wants. Then finally, the worst situation is when we have both low acidity and low sugar content that produces what most people would say rather tasteless. And quite frankly, that combination oftentimes is a result of picking tomato fruits in the breaker stage, shipping them hundreds of miles, and forcing them into artificial color development in a maturity or ethylene chamber. The result is something that makes our homegrown tomatoes so very, very valuable, because the quote chipped in ones simply are tasteless. Sugar, in the case of tomatoes or other things that we consume as fruits or vegetables is measured in a unit called degrees Brix. It's measured with an instrument called a refractometer, and the refractometer bends a ray of light differently depending upon the sugar content in the tomato juice placed on the refractometer's lens. When I show you that cherry or grape tomatoes, by and large, are usually very sweet. Sweet 100, All-American selection of a number of years ago, is very aptly named. It has a Brix reading of double digits, and there are sun sugar and other aptly named cherry tomatoes that are quite sweet. Most common slicing tomatoes are not that sweet. From the standpoint of the Brix content, we might push 7 and 8 at times, but it's very difficult to get a Brix reading higher than that. A reading would be equivalent then to percent sugar in the tomato juice. Now, there's also another reason that cherry tomatoes usually taste sweeter to us than tomatoes that are slicers. I have underlined on the slide glucose and fructose. These are two types of sugar. Fructose, on a scale of 1 to 100, where 100 is table sugar, the type you might sprinkle over your cereal in the morning, is rated at 100. Fructose has a rating of 120. Glucose less than 100. So because cherry tomatoes and these grape tomatoes have more of their sugar in the sweet fructose form, they're perceived by the tongue as being more flavorful. I want to also talk about the role of potassium in fruit quality. Potassium, as you know, is a mineral element, a macro element needed in large amounts by plants, but in tomatoes it plays a very important role in producing top quality fruit. First of all, potassium tends to influence the level of sugars that are developed, and as well the ability of a tomato to ripen properly and to store. Trials in the United Kingdom show that inadequate supplies of potassium in tomatoes lead to uneven ripening, what we call blotchy ripening. We'll show you what this means a bit later in the presentation. There also later in the presentation will be a number of fruit disorders described to you. In most all cases, we can prevent those disorders from occurring by putting on superabundant amounts of the element potassium. That seems to be the cure, if you will, for many fruit quality trait problems that we have in tomato. So let's talk a little bit about growing a flavorful tomato. And keep in mind that we have to start with good genetics. And by that we mean that the tomato variety that we select would have the ability to produce those sugars and acids and so forth, given the proper environment. Let's begin with a discussion about the importance of the soil. I'm a firm believer that if you take care of a plant's root system first, then everything else in growth of that plant and its productivity becomes easier. Tomatoes prefer a well-drained garden loam. Loam being a mixture of sand, silt, and clay. And then, of course, we need some organic matter with that loam in order to retain moisture and as well to keep it well drained and aerated. Tomatoes like slightly acidic soil, pH of about 6.5, and in the case of soil that in spite of our best effort is still poorly drained, then raised beds or berms would be a good idea. The soil is of such importance that we ought to have our soil tested as home gardeners about every third year. Commercial growers have it tested every year. They need to know what has happened from one growing season to the next to the soil, because it is the basis of their crop and the crop of their livelihood. I want to point out here to know the history of compost that we might apply in an attempt to improve the organic matter. What you're looking at here would be the result of accidental herbicide contamination by gardeners who, in the best of intention, went out and got some compost, or maybe before that manure that they composted, that was from animals, often horses, sometimes cattle, that had been fed hay, that broadleaf herbicides were used on in the field to produce better quality hay. The same can occur if the herbicide is used to treat pasture land and the animals graze on the pasture land and we use the manure. Make sure you know the history of the compost before adding it to soil that is destined to grow tomatoes. Tomatoes are extremely sensitive to all sorts of herbicides, and the new use, or let's say the more frequent use now, of broadleaf herbicides on pasture and hayland has caused a real problem. Additional important environmental components for good tomato production would be, first of all, sunshine. Light is life to a plant. Tomatoes are full sun plants and need a minimum of 8 hours of direct sun each day. Better that they receive sun all day long, but below 8 hours, you're going to be disappointed in the growth and productivity, as well as the quality of the tomato fruits that are produced. Another important environmental component is that of temperature. If we could dial in the ideal temperature for our tomatoes in the garden, it would be somewhere in the neighborhood of about 82, 83 degrees during the day and maybe 64, 65 degrees at night. These temperatures would represent ideal for photosynthetic activity, manufacture of food, versus the rate of respiration, the breakdown of that food by the tomato plant itself. Temperatures that are either too high, above 97, or too low, 55 or below, result in poor pollination. What you see in the picture would be a tomato flower that did not pollinate. And again, if we have high temperatures or low temperatures, this can happen. So it makes no difference what the temperature is after the tomato failed to pollinate. We don't have a fruit that's going to be enlarged. Hopefully the temperatures will fall back into the ideal stage and the resulting pollinated flowers under more ideal temperatures will enlarge naturally. Great temptation that a lot of tomato growers have would be to plant early. There's somewhat of a a point of pride of having the first ripe tomatoes in the neighborhood. And in an attempt to do that, we often plant before we really should, because tomato is a frost-sensitive, very tender plant. So early planting results in what you see in the picture, the loss of the plant to a frost or freeze event. In most cases, even if we plant early and it doesn't freeze, the tomato just doesn't react the way it should, because soil temperatures are still cool when we plant early. So knowing the frost-free dates in your area of Missouri or of the Midwest would be a good indication of when to plant tomatoes. We usually wait until we have passed the 80-20% frost-free date, meaning that there's only a 20% chance that it will freeze after the date in question, and hopefully the soil will have warmed sufficiently by that time. Tomatoes are very heavy feeders, and we need to again emphasize the testing of soil on a fairly regular basis, and then to amend the soil with additional fertilizer. It's recommended that we put down pre-plant a fertilizer that is fairly low in nitrogen but high in phosphorus and potassium. There is a fertilizer that has the analysis of 6-24-24. The company that makes it brands it as their Sure Start analysis. Well, that's a good analysis to put down as pre-plant. We want to put down a goodly amount of the phosphorus and potassium needed by the tomato pre-plant, but not that much nitrogen to begin with, because we don't want to force lush vegetative growth early on. Putting this down at the rate of about 1 pound per 100 square feet, and the old adage, a pint's a pound the world around, or a pint per 100 square feet, is a good general recommendation when we don't have the fertilizer test results at our disposal. Secondarily, we put on fertilizer after the tomatoes have planted and when they're growing, especially when they're setting on and enlarging fruit. I have circled the potassium analysis in a fertilizer that is sold expressly for tomato production. It carries the analysis 4-1838. It's put on in a combination with a form of nitrogen, so that, let's say we put on calcium nitrate, one fertilizing, and we put on this 4-1838 the second. We can't put them on at the same time because they will precipitate out gypsum if we're putting them on with a fertilizer injector. And again, we say about 1 pound of actual nitrogen per 100 foot of row, and we repeat this on 10-day or 2-week intervals. The final thing we have to do is to watch for magnesium deficiency. This fertilizer that we talk about here, having a lot of phosphorus and potassium, has no magnesium. And again, magnesium can become a problem with regard to tomato nutrition. What you're looking at here would be the lower leaf, and typically magnesium deficiency shows up as intraveinal chlorosis of the lower leaf. What you see in the picture would be very, very typical of magnesium deficiency. So we prevent this from happening by augmenting the fertilizers that we put on with Epsom salts. It's simply potassium sulfate. It's very important to put on the proper form of the element nitrogen. Nitrogen can only be taken up by the plant in two different forms. The nitrate form, which we'll call the good form, and the ammonium form, which we'll call a poorer form. Examples of nitrate form would be calcium nitrate, previously mentioned, or potassium nitrate. If they had their druthers, tomatoes would rather have, like most plants, their nitrogen in the nitrate form. Ammonium nitrate has a goodly amount of its nitrogen in the ammonium form. Urea, which is more easily obtained and frankly a bit less expensive than ammonium nitrate, has all of its nitrogen in the ammonium form. And we run the risk of, in tomato, developing what we call ammonium toxicity, as seen in the picture in the center. This is simply a matter of a plant reacting to too much of its nitrogen in the ammonium form to the point that that becomes toxic. Another environmental component that is very important would be water. Tomato fruits are about 95% water. So it stands to reason that if we're to enlarge a fruit and develop those sugars and acids, we need adequate amounts of water. And this should be the easiest of the environmental components for us to supply. By and large, tomatoes need between 1 and 2 inches of water per week. So if we don't get that by natural rainfall, then we should be ready to supply that with supplemental irrigation. For the sake of preventing diseases, it's important to keep tomato leaves dry. Therefore, applying water, and again, that's between 1 and 2 inches a week, via drip irrigation is an ideal way to help prevent disease by keeping the foliage dry, as well as by reducing our water bill, because we're putting it on only when their plant needs it and where it needs it, at the soil level via the drip irrigation process. A few other things that are helpful with regard to growing better tomatoes would be staking and trellising, if you will, getting them up and off the ground. The type of staking or trellising that we might employ would depend upon whether we are growing a determinate type, as we show you here on the left-hand side, where the tomato plant itself ends in a flower cluster, or an indeterminate type, as you see on the right-hand side, where the tomato plant ends in a vegetative growing point. Indeterminate types are the so-called vining type, and will continue to grow and grow and grow as long as the environment is conducive to growth and the plant doesn't freeze. Determinate types grow to that predetermined point on the plant, at which time a flower cluster is developed and the plant stops growing. Well, determinate types we might stake, as you see in this picture, or we might use tomato cages, or the so-called European overhead wire system, but giving the tomato the ability to continue to grow because it's an indeterminate type. Contrast that with the determinate type. Sometimes these are called in seed catalogs semi-determinate because they do get a bit larger than the so-called patio tomatoes, but they do stop growing at a predetermined height. This is an example of semi-determinates growing in a high tunnel. I want to show you here. Here is the use of the so-called short stake weave system. The semi-determinate tomatoes are becoming very popular with commercial growers. Now, they grow and plant a number of different plantings of them, perhaps the first in a high tunnel, maybe a heated greenhouse, and the second planting in a high tunnel. And the third and the fourth plantings being grown outdoors, because they fruit for only a while and then stop growing, we have to make successive plantings. We illustrate the stake and weave. We put in a short stake every second plant, and then, as is illustrated here with this particular piece of equipment, it's simply a PVC pipe through which twine, sisal twine, jute twine, has been threaded, and then we weave between, back and forth, and around the stake, and in between, back and forth, as we go down the row. Very easy way to get the tomato plants up off the ground, making them a bit easier to tend, a bit easier to harvest, and so forth. Does not mean that we have to support, but you'll usually find that the tomatoes are a little bit higher quality if they're kept up and off the ground. Another procedure that we really recommend would be to prune, or sometimes the term is to sucker a tomato. The yellow arrow in the picture is pointed at a sucker. This is simply an axillary bud that is developing where the leaf joins the tomato stem, and there will be a sucker developed at each leaf axis. So suckering is simply removing or pruning out those axillary buds. In the case of the determinate types that we described to you, we usually prune out to the first fruit cluster, and that's usually the first 5 leaves, and then a fruit cluster will develop. There are 5 embryonic leaves in the tomato seed, and then it'll start developing after the 5 leaves fruit clusters. And from there, it's usually 3 leaves in a cluster, 3 leaves in a cluster, or so forth. So there are many who grow determinate that prune the suckers out for the first 5 leaves and then allow everything to grow. For indeterminates, we usually prune all the suckers, or there is the so-called Missouri method, where we allow the sucker below the fruit clusters to remain in, but we pinch out the growing points of those suckers after 2 leaves. This leaves on a bit more leaf area because it's below a fruit cluster. Those leaves tend to grow up and to somewhat shade the tomatoes, causing less sun scorch to be a problem. And because it allows more area of leaves to remain, it does give the plant more leaf area to photosynthesize. It's also a good idea to remove older leaves on the plants. Leaves that are below the current maturing or ripening fruit cluster can be relieved without any detriment to the plant. Tomato problems certainly can deter from tomato quality and as well as from tomato yield. So we would now like to take a look at some of the more prevalent tomato problems and give a few tips on their management. The bane of the existence of most tomato growers would be early blight caused by the fungal organism Alternaria solani. Very typical symptoms of early blight would be these bullseye-shaped lesions that appear first of all, followed by yellowing along the lesions, and then finally, as we see here on the right-hand side, necrosis in the lower leaves especially. This is a soil-borne disease, and we recommend what we call an integrated pest management regimen of trying to control this. The first would be crop rotation. Never plant tomatoes in the same spot in your garden until 3 years have passed. So 1, 2, 3, 4, repeat. 1, 2, 3, 4, repeat, so forth. Even if moving the plot only 6 feet from where it was last year does help reduce the fungus inoculum. That's the part of the fungus that is infective and remains in the soil. The second thing that we recommend would be to mulch the tomatoes to keep soil from splashing up on the lower leaves, allowing the fungus inoculum to get its start on living tissue. The third thing is to keep leaves dry. And another reason that we recommend drip irrigation. In very wet, rainy years, this is very difficult to do because we can't prevent it from raining. Nonetheless, keeping the leaves as dry as possible is a third tactic in integrated pest management control of early blight. And then finally, we look at chlorothalonil. Chlorothalonil is the active ingredient in a number of different fungicides. It is now off patent, so there are numbers of companies that now make fungicides having chlorothalonil as their active ingredient. And we have found chlorothalonil to be very, very effective against early blight and other foliar diseases of tomato. It frankly is also safer for people than the old heavy metal based Zeneb and Maneb and other kinds of fungicides of days of old. Septora leaf spot is very closely related. Septora is the name of the genus of the fungus. The good news is that, again, chlorothalonil will tend to control Septora as it does Alternaria. Bacterial speck is caused by a bacterium. It's closely related to bacterial spot. In both cases, they do show symptoms on the leaves first, as you can see, the spotting or the specking. And when it becomes more severe, it will attack the fruit. The best that we can do is to apply fixed copper compounds. Copper hydroxide is an example of a fixed copper compound. These organisms also overwinter in the soil, so keeping the soil from splashing up on the leaves in the springtime as it rains would be a way to prevent. Unfortunately, the ability to control by the use of fixed copper becomes a little bit less successful as the temperatures warm during the summer. Here we have bacterial canker, which results in something that looks like early blight. But on the other hand, you will note at the right the involvement of the disease organism on the fruit. Bacterial canker is a rather difficult disease to control. Sanitation is always a good idea, and again, the use of fixed copper compounds. Beware of herbicide damage. This is not a disease. It's an abiotic disorder. On the left, you see 2,4-D, the typical twisting of the new growth. And on the right, glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup in other products now. Again, we mentioned that tomatoes are extremely sensitive to herbicides of all types. And 2,4-D might be applied by a neighbor a half a mile away. If the wind currents are correct, or what we call an inversion takes place, it actually can cause damage on your tomatoes even though it was applied a half a mile away. Don't confuse herbicide damage with physiological leaf curl. This is what you see on this slide. This is simply a reaction to heat and water stress. And while we try to keep the plants well watered, especially in certain varieties, it really is almost impossible to prevent physiological leaf curl. That's the bad news. The good news is that it really doesn't seem to deter from the productivity or the quality of the tomato that much. Of course, we would rather that it didn't show the leaf curl, but even when it does, we still get good yields of high quality fruit. Let's take a look at a few fruit problems. What you see on the slide is blossom end rot. Obviously, a little more pronounced on the right. Blossom end rot directly is caused by a lack of calcium. Indirectly, it's caused by a lack of water. So we can have blossom end rot with adequate amounts of calcium, but inadequate amounts of water. And conversely, we can have blossom end rot with adequate amounts of water, but inadequate amounts of calcium. If we have inadequate amounts of both, we have a disaster. This is why, or one reason why, we recommend the use of calcium nitrate as that nitrogen source. You are feeding plants the desired nitrate form of nitrogen, and at the same time, we're feeding calcium in a water-soluble, easily taken up form of calcium. Fruit cracking, another water-related problem where we have differences in wetting and drying. In other words, the plant might dry a bit, we add water, or it rains, and then all of a sudden the plant takes up too much water from the standpoint of being able to resist the turgor pressure created within the fruit. Left-hand side would be indicative of radial fruit cracking, where we have these cracks radiating out from the stem, and on the right, concentric cracking, where in a concentric ring around the stem, the cracks tend to form. We mentioned blotchy ripening before. This can be due to a number of different things. You'll usually find, however, that if you have some light penetrating through the leaf canopy and you're feeding abundant amounts of potassium, as well as feeding nitrogen in the preferred nitrate form, blotchy ripening tends to be much less of a problem. The next series of tomato fruit disorders are all associated with inadequate amounts of potassium. White, or sometimes called green core. You have the center of the tomato here, which forms a hard white core, which never truly ripens out. And that does affect the ability of the grower, if it's a commercial grower, to sell, or the homeowner to consume the fruit. Yellow shoulder is almost exclusively found on what are called green shouldered tomatoes. These are tomatoes that, when they're green, have a darker green area on the top side of the tomato than further down where it's lighter green. Well, that dark green never totally ripens out. And again, we look toward allowing adequate amounts of light to penetrate the leaf canopy by doing pruning, as well as adequate amounts of potassium. Gold fleck, sometimes called yellow fleck, again, superficial. You peel that off. The below tissue is perfectly normal, but it simply looks bad. Potassium. Super abundant amounts of potassium, and this almost always disappears on subsequent fruit. Zipper scarring is a mechanical problem in that the anther of the male part of the flower sticks to the ovary. Upon enlargement, then the scar that you see here shows itself cosmetic. When it's a little bit more pronounced, as you see here on the right, it indeed might make the fruit unedible, or certainly unsaleable, but it doesn't really take away from the interior quality. Cat facing is a very unusual shaped fruit, and it almost always happens only when the temperatures are cool. The fruits look frankly hideous. Inside, they may or may not be deformed, but it certainly takes away from the appearance and likely from the table quality of the fruit itself. This is stink bug damage as we get into some of the insects. This looks a lot like that gold fleck that we showed you before, but what you see here would be the feeding area of just hundreds upon hundreds of feeding events. Stink bugs have a mouth part that has a stylet. It punctures the epidermal layer, and then the stink bug sucks juices from the tissue below. Well, if you get dozens upon dozens of those feeding events, you have this kind of damage occurring. Tomato fruit worm is the same organism, same insect, I should say, moth, that gives rise to the corn earworm. And here you see the larva. And yes, it can do a lot of damage in a hurry because they have voracious appetites. In summary, hope we have described to you the fact that tomato flavor is usually what indicates a good tomato versus a poor one. And that flavor is interaction of the genetic makeup of a variety and the environment in which that variety is grown. So our effort in growing a good tomato begins with the selection of a genetically superior variety and then trying to provide the best environment that we possibly can when it comes to light, temperature, water, soil fertility, and so forth. We know there will be problems, but keeping a close eye on these problems and reacting to them as soon as we see them is the best way to manage them. In certain cases, prevention is the only cure. I want to leave you with a very late development. The University of Florida identified what's known as the crimson gene. This causes about 40% more lycopene. It's the pigment that causes a red tomato to be red, to develop in the tissue of the tomato. And what I'll show you here is a new All-American selection called Mountain Majesty. Now, they don't necessarily contain more sugar, acid, or so forth, but when you cut one of these tomatoes open, you can't help but smile because they are the reddest red you have ever seen in a tomato. And indeed, there might be a little bit of psychological suggestion going on here that a tomato that red ought to taste good. But on the other hand, you will find now, I think, more and more tomatoes being released containing the so-called crimson gene. And by the way, lycopene is known to be a potent antioxidant and hence is a phytonutrient for humans. Therefore, eating a tomato that has 40% more lycopene would be ostensibly a bit better for you than eating a tomato with just the regular amount of lycopene. This concludes my presentation. I thank you for your attention and hope that you have found something that you might be able to take home with you and next growing season grow better tomatoes.